I'm a cognitive neuroscientist by training, and I kind of had a long story into how I got into all of this, but in short, I had a few experiences that I couldn't explain with science. And so normally I would just ignore that and live in cognitive dissonance, but then I think enough of them piled up. And I think I was having kind of an existential crisis at the time, and I just thought, what if I thought about this or explored it a little bit? And then one thing led to another, and I couldn't stop exploring about it, like everything about it.
Mm,
So I got really into it um, to kind of reconcile like my experiences with my scientific training.
I think, regardless of what your background is, once you really get opened to these questions, something that seems so simple, is consciousness a process of the brain or whatever? Starting with a simple concept like that, you don't realize how many different aspects of life and creation
Mhm.
and the universe as a whole that encompasses, because then suddenly, what does that mean about who I am? What does that mean about matter? What does that mean about the fabric of the universe? And it all ties in, and yeah,
Mhm.
it gets very it opens up very many questions that you don't even consider there being in the first place. So I suppose let's start with some of those experiences if you're happy to share those.
Yeah. I mean, when I was younger, I had precognitive dreams a lot, but they were not super frequent. So I kind of ignored them. And then when I went into graduate school, I think at the beginning of graduate school, I was interested in like coincidences, and I would never have called it this, but I felt very connected and in the flow with the universe. But I didn't think about it. I didn't think that it was spiritual. It was just my experience. But then by the end of graduate school, especially in neuroscience, they train you that the brain looks for coincidences, that there's no external meaning in the world, that we create meaning um, through our brains. So by the end of that training, a lot of the, I guess, wonder and magic that I may have felt in life was kind of snuffed out. Um, and then also I'm Persian, so our culture is actually pretty mystical. Like indigenously, we're Zoroastrian, so there's a lot of mysticism that runs through it, and we have some rituals and practices that still carry over to today. So my grandmother used to do divination using coffee grinds, like not American coffee, it's Turkish, Armenian, Greek coffee, where you leave the grinds in the
Mm.
cup and it forms pictures. And she taught my mother how to do that. And so my mom would always read at family parties. And I didn't even know what it was or what was going on. And then she started reading for me and when I was in graduate school, and I would go home on the weekends. And then I ignored it at first, but I would take notes, and I noticed that what she said would come true, and sometimes months in advance, or like she would keep saying something and then it would happen. And it would be things that I wouldn't know are coming. She wouldn't know, like things that were just out of the purview of either of our experiences. And then suddenly it would be there. And so then that got my attention, and I just took notes for years and years. And I lived in cognitive dissonance because I couldn't obviously explain it with science. There wasn't even a framework to try to explain it.
Mm.
And so I didn't bother. I just was like, I don't know what this is or how it works, but it seems to work. So if she would say something, I would, kind of pay attention to it. Like if she's like, make sure you don't lose money or things like that. And then, there was a time over the course of a few years where two of my mom's saw two events that happened in my life, like in the coffee, months before they happened. And I think because they were really big emotional events. So one was like the murder of someone I knew at my university. And then the second was the ending of a relationship. I think because they were emotional events, they really shook me
Mm.
because, like, up to that point, they had been casual day to day things. But then the first one was a life or death thing, and that really shook me. And then the second one was a relationship. And so at that point, I was also hitting, like, I was way out of grad school at that point, kind of just living, working, and starting to ask, like, what is the point of all
Mm.
this? Kind of having an existential crisis. So all of those things together, it was kind of over the course of a few years, but started to get my interest, right? Like, so after the relationship ended, I was, and my mom, like, it related to the coffee, she had kind of, seen a lot of details. I kind of had a crisis, like a total, not just, I was already having an existential crisis, and then it turned into a crisis of, I don't understand what the universe is and how it works, and why we're here. And so then I, I mean, for a while I was just not doing well. Like, I was confused and felt like despair, and because of the confusion. So that went on for a while, but then eventually I started to get curious about the readings and about the universe. And then that launched me on this kind of this different path of exploring, because I was curious to just understand, because it felt so
Unknown.
amorphous.
Mm.
Like, just, yeah, I felt unmoored, and the whole thing felt amorphous, like I couldn't understand. And so it got to a point where I couldn't exist in that state anymore. So
Mm.
I had to do something about it. And so that caused me to explore.
Mm-hmm. So, I'd imagine, have you shared kind of these experiences with some of your neuroscientific colleagues before? And what kind of responses have they given in their explanations of that?
Yeah. So when I started the project, it was a personal project just for me. It was to interview intuitives and mystics and scientists, because I started to entertain these ideas. And then I thought, am I crazy? And am I the only scientist who, like, am I the only one who's dumb enough to fall for this?
Mm-hmm.
So I started interviewing my colleagues that I'd known for, like, at that point over a decade. And we had never talked about anything spiritual or paranormal or anything. And so that was kind of the point, was to talk to them about this stuff and be like, so I told them this, my story about the coffee and everything. And they were all, the ones I spoke to, which was, again, it was a personal project. So at the time, the beginning of this, it was just a handful of them, but they were they all had their own experiences. So that surprised me. Like, they would start telling me stories, whether it was themselves or people in their lives. Like, one of them, it was his mother, also was very, I guess you would call it psychic or whatever, but she would have all these experiences. And he would tell me, he's like, it's weird, but she was usually right, like, about whatever she would say. Um, and so it just turned out that they all had their own experiences, and they were all much more open than I thought they would be. And of course, these were private
Mm.
conversations that we were having. So they were just like, we don't know everything in science. Like, if there's even one case of something, then then it's an anomaly, but it doesn't mean that it didn't
Yeah,
happen or it doesn't exist.
yeah.
Like, it just means that if we can't explain it, then our models are not correct. So and some of them were much more open to mystery. I think at that point I was very much like, no, I have to understand, and like, I could not accept that something would be a mystery. And some of them were very, like, laissez-faire about it. They were just like, I don't know, we probably won't be able to know everything, and there's a lot of mysteries in the universe, and they were just okay with it. And I was like, how can you just be okay with it?
Mm-hmm.
But it was educational to see that none of them, maybe only one of them, there was one colleague I spoke to who was just very skeptical, and who was like, but even he had looked into this stuff. Like, even he at some point had been interested in it and had explored it. He came away skeptical, but most of the other ones were, I wouldn't say they were open. I don't know if they would have been that open if we had those conversations in public,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but they were yeah, we were open, and we just thought, these are, some of them even told me, they're like, this is partly why I went into neuroscience.
Mm.
Like, I'm interested in philosophy and the nature of the universe, and decided neuroscience was a good way to pursue that academically.
Sure.
So it was pretty interesting.
Mm. And of course, neuroscience is kind of at the core of everything, because that is at the core of our current understandings of ourselves, And it's a very widely, I think, misunderstood belief that the scientists of neuroscience and neurochemistry, etc., already know that consciousness is produced by the brain, you know, and
That's an
it
assumption
is,
that we
and it's
make.
certainly, as far as I can see, not the case at all. You know.
Yeah, we tend to. So when I went on this journey before I encountered because the thing is that what you just mentioned is an invisible assumption that we make in the sciences and especially in neuroscience. So you start from that basic assumption. Nobody ever addresses it when you're getting trained. It's kind of just accepted and it's invisible. And so you're never aware that you are operating in a particular worldview or a particular philosophy. So when I started encountering this stuff, it made no sense because I was looking at it through a particular worldview, not realizing that that's like a filter and blinders and that there were other worldviews available. This was like just not on my radar because nobody ever teaches
Mm.
you that unless you take a philosophy course, which many people do not. So um, when I was encountering the evidence, I remember that was part of my confusion. And then as soon as I hit philosophy, the literature on philosophy and worldviews, suddenly everything made sense. And it was like, because it's like all these frameworks were made available that explained some of the data. And then you suddenly realize, oh, we've adopted this framework, but it doesn't mean it's the right one. It's just one we've
Mm.
adopted for various reasons. And yeah, and it may not be the right one. And you find out, yeah, like every single day there's new headlines published in physics and philosophy and cosmology that like this is still an ongoing debate. And so I started thinking, oh, that's really interesting. Like in the sciences, we aren't even aware of any of this debate going on, and we operate under
Mm.
one worldview and then defend it to
Mm.
our deaths.
And it's a
So
shame because, you know, philosophy derives or should derive from science and should be malleable with science, and it should be science that shapes those philosophies. But we'll get onto that in a bit. But I wanted to kind of ask immediately, when I think of things like coffee grinds and divination of that kind of thing, my immediate thought wants to go straight to, you know, things like this will turn out to be true just on the laws of, you know, probability once every so often. And is it the case that we don't kind of take notice of those many more that don't hit as opposed to those that do? That's kind of immediately where
yeah.
my thought goes. What do you think to that kind of position?
Yeah. Well, that's what I thought too. That's definitely what they train us to think. And it's true. Humans have confirmation bias and look for you remember evidence that supports your beliefs and discard evidence that doesn't, for sure. And that's why things like tarot or coffee ground readings or psychic readings are good for personal experience, but they're not great for scientific evidence. So then that's where you need scientific studies, which there has been a lot of. And so that was the case for me. So I came into this thinking no research had been done on this. So I was exploring it just personally, like getting readings and stuff. But then when I started interviewing other scientists who are doing this, like psi or psychic
Mm.
phenomena or intention or whatever
Mm-hmm.
research, they quickly were like, oh, there's like 100 years of research on this from like hundreds of different labs, hundreds of thousands of participants, like good universities like UCLA, UC Berkeley, Princeton, Duke. And they gave me the references. And so I went to read all the papers. And so that's why and there was so much evidence,
Mm.
like way more evidence for that than some of the other things that we take for granted in science.
Mm.
That when I finished reviewing it, I was like, oh, okay, like this is just a real phenomena. Like if we use the standards of science that we use in neuroscience or psychology, unless our statistics are all wrong or our scientific methodology
Mm.
isn't right, then you can't throw this data out
Yeah.
and accept the rest.
Yeah.
It's either or, right? Um, so that's why studies are important, because it validates. They're not ideal because the laboratory setting is not real life, and every time you do an experiment, you change something. But they're the best that we
Mm.
have, right? So that's why studies are important because there is scientific evidence for this. It's pretty strong, and that's why I sometimes at the beginning of this, I don't care now anymore, but I used to get frustrated. Like, would be telling stories because people like stories, but then they would immediately start debunking it.
Yeah,
And then you'd have to be like, okay, here are all the scientific studies. Like,
indeed.
you can go read them if you
And
want. Yeah.
I think the only other problem with scientific studies, it's good to know that these scientific papers exist and to cite them as evidence, but you must be able to know how to interpret the data that's given, and that's why I turn more to the scientists who have trained to be able to interpret these things, rather than just the odd kind of mouthpiece to those who say yes, there are these studies that prove this, and you say, well, do they? Do they prove that
Mm-hmm.
that mediumship is bunk? Have you read them? Well, no, but they obviously are because
Yeah.
this scientist said so. Did he say that, or have you just not read the? So it's important to be able to interpret that data as well as being able to cite it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, most scientists haven't. They're not aware of the research, just like I wasn't, and well, most of them just aren't aware.
Mm.
Like it's kind of like a common knowledge thing. We just think, oh, it's been debunked, but nobody can cite a study
Mm.
unless you've looked into it.
Yes, and I think it was it Dean Radin, especially from the Institute of Noetic Sciences, that mentioned, it might not have been him, but I think it was him that mentioned that the results, the statistic results that we've received from, as you said, from the psi phenomena are using the same statistical methods that have been used to prove other phenomena, are more than, if not even stronger, for psi phenomena than
Yeah.
they are for currently accepted paradigms and currently accepted theories.
Yeah, absolutely. Like when I read them, I was surprised at like they used some of the same experimental protocols that we use in psychology. So it wasn't like so that kind of struck me because I thought, oh, I'm going to read this and it's going to be like a really weird study.
Mm.
And like some of them were really weird and different than what I'm used to that I'm trained in, but some of them were classic psychology, neuroscience studies that they would just flip like the order of something so that it was the time variable. They would flip that. And so then and then the results, yeah, they would use the same stats that we used, and you could compare
Mm.
to other regular scientific studies that had been published. And that's what convinced me. And I
Yeah.
thought, oh, okay, so either these are valid, or if you're going to say these aren't valid, then you have to say a lot of our regular science is not valid too.
Mm.
Something,
Mm.
something has to give.
Indeed. And as you say, although studies aren't ideal for kind of understanding the nature of phenomena, because it's not something that happens in real time, it's reduced to a lab. It's I suppose the important thing about those studies is it's able to isolate those phenomena without the confounding variables that are controlled for. So I think the initial importance of those studies is to identify that a phenomena exists, and then it's a case of
Yes.
exploring it in the wild, so to speak, to understand why and how on a broader scale. And it seems that
Yeah.
most people think that because, or I don't even know if it's true, but most people that I've spoken to who are skeptical about psi specifically have said that parapsychology, over the many hundreds of years of its existence as a field of research, hasn't advanced as a science, in which case it suggests it's bunk, so to speak. What's your thought on that?
Um, I just think there's no funding that goes into it, so of course it has an advance. I don't think that's a very good argument. That's like
Mm.
it's not a very intellectual argument. No, and I think if you like in my book I published or commented on a review that was published in 2018, and in science when you do a review it means you take all of the research that's been done, right, in this one field, put it together, and then look at the effect sizes,
Mm.
the statistics, and then you say, is there an effect here or not? And that's how it is. Like in science, you never take one study and say you have to do like because of statistics and the way the universe works, probability wise, you have to do a bunch to say, okay, there's been 100 studies, and then if you show like 60 of the 100 show an effect, there's probably something there. And so in 2018, there was a review published on psi or psychic phenomena, and it showed a strong, well, not a strong effect, but
Mm.
an effect that's comparable to like many other things that we, in my book, I compared it. So, for example, some of the effect sizes, I won't, I'm sure people get bored when I say effect sizes, but they were comparable to like what we use in clinical research. So in clinical research, it's like you need to reach a certain effect size for like a treatment to be taken seriously or to be considered clinically valid. And so they were comparable to those, like to aspirin, to antidepressants, to diabetes medication. When you compared the effect sizes, they were comparable. So it's that. So if you to say that the field hasn't advanced isn't fair. If you took any time to
Mm,
read
mm,
anything like a recent search in Google Scholar, like you would find that review and you
mm.
wouldn't be able to say that.
I think many people who aren't familiar with statistical analyses would say, the effect size is what kind of turns them away from it. Because if, say, you have a graph on a range of, I don't know, say 0 to 100% of whatever, it doesn't really matter, but that the effect that we see in psi research, say, the ions study, I think that's still ongoing, where they were looking for effects of a random number generator or to move a line up, and I can't remember the specific one, but in
Yes.
other words,
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
was, you know what I mean, there was an effect, but it was tiny, a very small effect. Maybe on a graph from a 0 to 100%, it would be maybe a 3% movement either way. And people would look
Yeah.
at that and think, well, that's not significant at all. A 3% move is, could happen randomly. There's no way you could tell. What would you say to that kind of
Well, I
belief?
would say that that's what statistics are for. So for us to look at a data set as a human without math and say 3% is not significant is not a valid way to assess it. You need the math to look at the all the numbers in the data set, and the statistics will tell you if it's significant or not. Because it could be that, let me think of a way to explain it. If you have a data set that is so what we call noisy, which means the numbers are all over the place. It's like 0, 1, 100, 200, 300, like they're so random. Um, and you have a random data point. When you zoom out, you're like, oh yeah, I mean, it's all random. This one number, it's not, it fits the data set. It's like, it's not significantly different. But if you put it on a graph and all the numbers were like between 0 and 50, and then you had certain numbers, under certain conditions that were consistently like 70 or even 200. And then you put it all together and you do the math, you're like, yes, this data set is not very noisy. So under these conditions, when you have this effect, it's significant.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what the statistics can tell you. So as a human, you can't look at something. It doesn't work that way. You have to use the math, because the stats takes the whole data set into account and says, this is unusual. This
Mm-hmm.
is not what you would expect.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a pattern. So it's like, yeah, you have to use the math.
Yeah. So I suppose you could say, that even though on this particular experiment, maybe the effect size of moving the line up and down was a tiny factor that seemed insignificant, but when you take all the studies or all the whole data set of that study together, it's the fact that that change was consistent, regardless of how small the effect size was. It still suggests that our minds had an influence over the data. Doesn't matter how small, it was consistent. Something like that.
Right. Yeah. And in the book I talk about this too, like effect you would, considering the fact that um, you know, if we take a mainstream view, it doesn't appear that people can willy-nilly affect matter with their mind, right? Otherwise we would have the X-Men,
Mm.
like we'd be living in a comic book. You would expect the effect size to be small, right? Because this does not seem to be something that is a big effect size, compared to something else that we can easily control, like me lifting my hand, like 100% of the time, in a healthy individual, if I intend to lift my hand and I do it, yeah, that's like a high effect size because it's obvious to everyone.
Mm.
But something that's not as obvious, that's not as common, that's not a strong effect, yeah, you would expect it to be small.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we would have, I
Yeah.
think of it like that.
Floating
Like we would
houses.
have X-Men
Yeah.
and everyone would know.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
So I wonder, I'm sure you've stumbled upon the Aware studies by Sam
Mm-hmm.
Parnia. What he's trying to do is replicate a near-death experience and or specifically, verifiable perception during a cardiac arrest. So he's got targets, or he had targets in a room where a cardiac arrest took place. His goal was to have someone come out of their body, see the target, report it. No hits, allegedly, from what we know so far. So, of course, people are taking that, the skeptics are taking that as strong evidence that the phenomena of out-of-body perception isn't real or is a result of hallucination, because there were no hits. What are your thoughts on those results and their their relevance to the near-death phenomena / visual perception phenomena.
Yeah. I mean, I think that again, that's why it's important to do the studies. We just have to keep that. So in near-death experiences, I'm not like super familiar with all the literature, but from what I know, there have been studies published, but there, from my assessment, could be a lot more. Like I think if you were to pull them all together and do a review, like I don't think there's enough. I hope, but again, I'm not. I hope someone doesn't. I'm not 100% sure, but my sense is that
Mm-hmm.
there needs to be more research and funding into it because yeah, maybe his study showed that, but you could have another that does. And with experiments, there's a lot of variables, from site to site. They're different. So again, it's important to do those. But it doesn't discount some of the anecdotal stories that you hear too, right? That tend to come from near death experiences, which are really interesting about people knowing things from other times or locations that they couldn't have possibly known when they were in cardiac arrest or yeah,
Mm-hmm.
or even under normal conditions. Like they're not in that space time and they're reporting something that's verifiably true. So yeah, I mean, I think the research is important. I don't know. I never think anything is definitive. So it's like, okay, that's what his study showed. We'll just see what more research
Mm-hmm.
shows.
Indeed, yeah. One of the books that I'm currently going through that I meant to for a while because it's one of those things you heard about but you'd never really, for some reason, just never started looking at is Julie Beischell's study at the Windbridge Institute, which is the quintuple blinded evidential mediumship studies, and that's very interesting because that is bringing something that is very, very, in a vast majority, considered nothing but fraud, and that's bringing it into a quintuple blinded study that's showing statistically significant results in favour of mediumship being a true receiver of information, verifiable information. I'm sure you're familiar with the studies. What are your thoughts on them?
Yeah. Yeah, they're very interesting. They're well controlled. And again, I think that's the kind of research you need for stuff like that, like mediumship, when I do think it's true. I think that honestly, there's so much going on when you are having a face-to-face interaction with somebody. Like from just a normal neuroscience perspective, you do pick up a lot unconsciously. People give off a lot unconsciously, and you pick up a lot unconsciously. So I think there is a lot of that. So in her study, where they tried to get around that, like separating people and not no names and totally. I think it was like the mediums just got maybe on paper and
I think it was just
I
a
can't
first
remember
name, wasn't it?
exactly, like a first name maybe, yeah, that was it, and then they just give information, and then they had like um people unrelated to it judge like the number of hits versus the person getting the reading from the person who passed away, that they're what was it called,
A
the
discarnate?
deceased, I guess they
A
call it.
discarnate,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, there you go. Discard. Yeah, I couldn't remember her term. Um, so I mean, you need that kind of research to validate this stuff. And I mean, yeah, it was a pretty well controlled study. And I think that again, there's not enough research, I think, on mediumship in that way. I think like Windbridge and Ions are starting to do that, but there needs to be so much more money put in. And because sometimes when there hasn't been, so there's been a lot of psychic phenomena research, right? Like that has been, there's a lot of that. And that's why those studies are pretty good because they've been scrutinized. And so every time they're, over 100 years, they've been improved and improved and improved to the point where they're really good, experimentally sound. And I think for mediumship, I think that they're still improving the protocols. So there needs more money and more research in it. But yeah, I think that that's exactly what's
Yeah.
needed. I think it's pretty good evidence because if it's like person to person, you can stretch what they say to make it fit, right? So you want something more objective.
And it's no secret that maybe 95% of mediums are doing that. Are tricking you. But unfortunately,
Apparently.
95% means there's still 5% of a genuine phenomena out there. And that I just pulled those numbers out of the air. It's probably a lot.
Oh, I was going to ask. I was like, where'd
Yeah,
you
no,
get those?
it's
And I've always been curious.
yeah, I don't know what the actual figures are, but yeah, just for illustrative purposes, even if 95% are total frauds and money grabbers, which a lot of them are, we know that, there's still 5% that show a true phenomena. So that's what we're interested in. And a lot of these are taken out of hand because, of course, a lot of them are going to be more subjective things. I love you, I miss you, etc., 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 which are good, which are great, but that doesn't help understand the phenomena. We need the
Right.
verifiable things,
Right. Exactly.
and unfortunately, I think a lot of the lack of funding is due to the mainstream scientific community regarding it as 100% fraud or 100% mistake, mistaken interpretation or whatever. And we'll move on to some of the other evidence, but a name that always comes up in the skeptical community, and this always comes up because it is kind of the most common retort, is, well, they didn't win the James Randi challenge. They should have won the James
I
Randi
hate when
challenge.
people bring that up.
Some people you ask will say, yes, I agree, it was perfectly, if the effect was there, they would have won the money. Others say, if you read the contracts, no one would have taken him up on it. Others say different things. It depends who you are. So what are your thoughts on that as a scientist?
Yeah, I think Randy is not a scientist, and I don't think a contest is the way to prove a phenomena.
Mm,
I think, again, it goes back to making sound experimental design and a lot of them, and to study something over time to prove its reality
mm,
or not. I mean,
mm.
like to me, the Randy, I just think it's
I,
like irrelevant.
I understand the thinking behind it, because surely if someone can get evidence from, or can just verify some information based on something paranormal, which I don't even like the word paranormal, but they should be able to demonstrate it at least once, publicly. So I can understand that thinking.
I just think they're two separate things. So it's like, as a scientist, like I would never look at that anyway. And I would never be like, at the beginning of my journey, if I was trying to figure this out, I would never go to the a contest held by a person who's not a scientist and be like, oh, definite, here we go.
Mm,
Someone proved it, or like that
mm,
doesn't, it's not evidence. It's a, yeah, it's like a nice story.
yeah, indeed. But it's interesting because it's not just kind of the lay folk that bring up the Rani challenge, but academics seem to as well.
I know.
And you
I
think
know.
it makes you think there must be some validity to it if the academics are citing this as evidence against, you know. But again, I
No.
don't know much about the Randy challenge outside of some people like it, some people don't.
I think I encountered that. Somebody, one of my colleagues, I remember, was like, "Oh, actually, two of them mentioned the Randy challenge to me." And then I went to look into it, and I'm like, "Why are they citing this? This guy's not even a scientist. This is not like I don't even understand what the point of this
Mm,
is." But and especially because the person who's putting on the contest is a skeptic, like has a belief. I think that's also going to, like, he's going to have confirmation
mm,
bias. Like the whole thing is biased. I don't know. To me, it's very strange that people cite it at all. But yeah, I always go back to just do the normal science, like do
mm,
experiments. I get the like appeal of, a big challenge, and yeah, sure, whatever, culturally,
mm,
that's nice.
mm,
It's a nice fun it's entertainment to me is what
mm,
it is.
mm. So we mentioned briefly the different philosophies surrounding what all this parapsychology and anomalous phenomena of it, anomalous experiences of consciousness phenomena lead to. What philosophy do you currently see as the most accurate, I suppose?
um well, I try to stay open now because I don't really know. But yeah, I think they're all really interesting. I mean, I do think I tend to I've moved away from scientific materialism mostly because it doesn't explain a lot of classes of phenomena. Like you have to ignore a lot of data to make the model work. And um, it comes back to that subjective objective divide in like philosophy and science. So science, tries to focus on the objective. And so, by definition, our subjective experiences are ignored. Um, and by doing that, scientific materialism works well. But you basically have to ignore half of human experience to do that. And so it doesn't make, so now I've moved away from that because I'm like, that's kind of dumb. And like when you think about like a lot of my neuroscientist friends and I would talk about, you can't measure a thought, but we know we have them. I mean, actually, our whole life experience is thoughts, but we can't measure them. And we have no way to compare them, like quality wise, to each other without subjective experience. And so for me, I've definitely moved away from scientific materialism. I don't know like what I try not to box
Mm,
in things. I think language and
yeah,
concepts are
indeed.
limiting now. So I don't know. I just know I moved away from that because it doesn't explain
No,
most of human
I think
experience.
it's
So
difficult to identify with a philosophy because in reality, there's as many philosophies as there are people on the planet. Regarding the unable to measure thoughts, I would imagine one could argue that regardless of not being able to see them qualitatively, we can identify them on the physical brain. We can show you the markers, and we can recreate dreams semi accurately based on the brain readings we get from someone who's asleep. What would you say to that? So therefore, sorry, the conclusion therefore being that we know that there is a material basis of thought, as we can show here.
yeah, well, I think there's obviously a correlation between the brain and subjective experience, but I mean, in science, you learn correlation isn't causation, like day one in statistics. So even though to get around that, that's how you get the worldview. The underlying invisible assumption, you just assume it to get around that problem is, oh no, we assume that this physical structure of the brain produces this, subjective experience, these thoughts, and we move forward with that assumption. But in fact, we don't know that. And I think it was Larry Dossey, Dr. Larry Dossey, who made this. I put it in my book, but he likens the brain to like, if it was like a TV,
Mm-hmm.
right? It receives a signal, and if the TV breaks or a part of the TV breaks, the signal stops. So I kind of think that we have not disproved that
Mm-hmm.
in science as well. Like it's extremely possible that the brain is also some sort of receiver. And there's a lot of theories being published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, like alternative models of consciousness being published now,
Mm.
saying things like that, like maybe consciousness is an energy field, maybe it's information, maybe when it interacts with our physical biological brain, you get awareness. So there's these things are emerging and being
Mm.
published and peer-reviewed now. So and yeah, so I think there's correlation, but there's no causation.
Mm.
And that comes up a lot because people again don't they never go because that's just kind of how our mainstream culture talks about it too. And so you hear people citing that a lot. And it frustrates me actually as a neuroscientist. Like they'll be like, oh, this I behaved this way because my amygdala lit up. And you're like, no, that's
No, your amygdala lit up because
that's
you
not
behave this
accurate.
way. Maybe is also, yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean the thing is we haven't determined or discerned the direction of effect. We just know they're correlated. So and that's really all we can say.
Mm. Yeah, quite right. And two rebuttals that I've heard to the brain as a receiver or reducing valve kind of metaphor is one, but why don't we see, therefore, we would see a physical representation of the consciousness entry point on the brain, which we haven't seen. And second, well, therefore, you need to show us how consciousness can exist outside of a physical brain in order to be received by it. And I can answer the second one quite easily because I'd just say, well, then show me how a physical brain can produce consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't defined consciousness. Like, the definition of consciousness is kind of difficult. Awareness, consciousness. Um, we can't even measure that yet. So in the brain, so much less outside of the brain. Um, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. There's a lot of things that we can't define or measure properly yet. The first one, what was it? An entry point? I've never
I
heard that
think it
before.
was, I can't remember exactly who said that, if consciousness does exist outside the brain and is
Yeah.
received by it, we should see physical markers of the entry point of consciousness.
Okay. Well, that sounds ridiculous. I don't even know what that means. But I will say that we don't know many things about the brain. So I think that that's a pretty ridiculous statement to make. But I think, for example, there's one theory that suggests, it's from Hammeroff and
Mm-hmm.
Penrose, that suggests that the
Or go off.
microtubules of the
Mm.
brain are interact quantumly, and that consciousness is quantum, and that's how it comes in. So that there's one theory, just one. I'm sure there's others that there's your entry point, microtubules.
Mm. That's the orchestrated. I can't remember the full name, but the Orco-R theory. Uh,
Yeah, orchestrated reduction. I don't know,
Something like that.
something.
Yeah, I need to understand more about that. But yeah, there are many different. You've got substance dualism, which is often frowned upon. You've got Orco-R. You've got IIT, and various other theories surrounding consciousness that are competing.
Yes, yes. Yeah, exactly. And that part of it comes back to that, is like, is is consciousness information, IIT, integrated information theory, in some ways posits that the more information a system has, the more conscious it is, right? So, and you can measure that mathematically, but maybe it's an energy, maybe it's quantum, as I mentioned, the Hammeroff Penrose theory suggests. So, like I said, we don't really know. It could be multiple things. It could be energy, it could be information, it could be. I mean, we don't
Mm.
really know.
Mm. So, what's your current understanding? Not that you've probably thought about it much because you're still young like me, but what are your thoughts on death? What death means, and what is one to expect?
Let me have some water. This is a question that,
It's not a small question. No.
before this whole journey for me, I thought you just
Mm.
go to
Gone.
sleep
Yeah.
and stop
As
existing.
did I.
And I thought that sounds nice.
See, that's funny because
But
I
then,
thought the exact opposite. I thought that sounds terrifying, which is why I went
yeah,
into all this. Mm.
I didn't have a problem with that. But so yeah, so what was interesting is when I started reading the past life regression literature, the near death stuff, like all those experiences where people, under all these very different conditions, they describe very similar scenarios of, oh, I met these guides and we planned my life and whatever they say, which sounds crazy to a scientific materialist, but these stories emerge like from people who don't believe these things, who have never heard these kinds of spiritual frameworks under various kinds of altered states, to the point where you're like, I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's worth entertaining that that's true, that you continue existing, that you plan another life, that come to learn lessons. Um, I will say I did I had a psychedelic experience last year where I had complete ego death, and
Was
I,
that dimethyltryptamine, ketamine,
yeah, it was five
5-MeO?
methoxy,
Mm.
yeah, 5-MeO DMT, and I had a near death experience, or yeah, I had complete ego dissolution, like my personality dissolved, and then I became the entire universe, all of space and time, and all of awareness, and it was like, obviously the craziest thing. um but I thought I had actually died in the experience, and I was like, oh shit, I didn't mean to die. um but it was, so when I came back, I felt like, and I had facilitators. So the
Mm.
next day I was telling them, I was like, you guys, it was like I died. And they were like, you did, like, in a
Mm.
way. Not like physically, but your ego dissolved. Like for a second, you didn't exist. And you got to see what that was. And so I felt like, in some ways, it scared me though. I know a lot of people come away from experiences like that, like not afraid of death, but I came away like kind of scared. I mean, and it was a nice experience. Like I can't, there's no words for this,
Mm.
but it was like euphoric, and I was just everything, and it was beautiful. But I think when you come back, it's so outside of your normal everyday experience that it shocks you in a way. Like
Mm.
you're just like, what is happening? Like,
Mm.
how do I get from this to that and that to this? And so, but I do feel, and someone asked me, like, do you feel like you know what death feels like now? And I think I guess I do. I mean, who knows for sure? No one knows, of course. It's like the question, but I do feel like that experience is probably what it's like. And it wasn't awful. I mean, it was beautiful and euphoric and life changing. So in some ways,
I think,
you know.
yeah, I think going down the psychedelic route of understanding death is difficult because, of course, you're also working. Your brain is also working under that influence, so there will be some kind of, as you mentioned earlier, some sort of noise in the experience that isn't completely accurate to what it would be like at death, unless, of course, during death we do have hallucinogenics naturally kind of flushed through our system as a result, which is a theory. We don't know. Um,
Yes.
and a lot of people who go under DMT, and there are therapies now that include that sort of thing for working through traumas and things, experience the same sort of thing. I would say, I've never done it myself or anything like. I'm terrified of anything that messes with my mind. But anyone that does do that, make sure you do it safely under a physician or under a facilitator, because
For sure.
recreationally, you don't know what could happen, and some very bad things have
Mm-hmm.
happened. So I wonder, looking at it from kind of a more natural approach to death during hospice care, and a lot of hospice carers have described
Oh
people
yeah.
seeing things, seeing their loved ones come to them, and you got things like terminal lucidity, and there's so many different things surrounding it.
Yes.
So I wonder what your thoughts are on that kind of more naturally inevitable experience.
Yeah. Yeah, there is this one, you're probably familiar with it. I forget his name though, but he is like a physician who works with end of life or something. And I think he actually did a study, or they did a study in a home, a hospice, maybe,
Peter Fennick.
maybe. I don't remember who it was, but they showed that they did an actual study, like, um and I think they show, I can't remember the percentage. I'm sorry, this is like the worst. I clearly read the study a long time ago, but basically the finding was that that the nearer that a person got to the time of death, the more frequently they reported seeing people in their lives who had passed away. And so you could basically, they learned you could predict when someone was going to pass away by the like more frequently they started mentioning, like, oh, my husband's
Mm,
here, or my daughter came to visit me last night, and they were people who had passed away. So I think things like that are really fascinating. I mean, I really do think, I mean, I guess I do believe that our consciousness survives death now. I think there's enough
mm,
evidence that you can't discount that
mm.
as a possibility, if you're being
I
fair
think
to
I
it.
think it's
So,
difficult to have really read and understood the literature on things like evidential mediumship and very out of body verified phenomena and things like that, and come away not thinking that we retain not only consciousness but individuality and memory to some degree.
right.
Which again, memory is a difficult one because again, people will point to, well, we can see where in the brain that is. New neurons are being formed and pathways are being strengthened. So how can that exist outside of the brain? That sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I think actually we don't really know how memory fully works. That's kind of a misconception. We don't have it all figured out in the brain. There's no like one area. It's actually like spread. It's like a network, or, but that's still unresolved. And again, every time people point to the brain, I always say, again, it's just correlation. There's still no proof that, again, if you think of it like the receiver, like I said
Mm,
before, there's no proof that the wiring is responsible for it.
mm,
So I also think it's really, I've been thinking about this lately. It's so fascinating that like we now have this concept of the cloud, like software in the
mm,
cloud and
mm.
stuff. So it's almost like now people can understand, like, maybe we are like that.
Yeah.
Where did that idea even come
Mm.
from? But maybe it is that it's something stored somewhere else and we access it.
Yeah, and that comes
I think
back
it's
nicely
entirely
to
possible.
Orco R and things like that.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah, exactly.
Are you familiar with terminal lucidity as a phenomenon?
Hmm.
You are. What do you think about that? Because that's very interesting to me, especially during cases of Alzheimer's and dementia and other brain degenerative diseases, which is effectively your neurons are breaking apart. And that would imply that if we look at it from a physical point of view, if consciousness is physical and awareness is physical, that would have to include some kind of regeneration toward the end of a degenerative disease in order for that consciousness to come back as it seems to do. So, what are your thoughts on terminal lucidity?
Yeah, well, from a neuroscience perspective, our explanation for things that we can't explain is always neuroplasticity.
Mm-hmm.
So, whenever, yeah, so like if I step back into my old um identity and someone presented that to me, I would be like, yeah, I don't know, the brain suddenly rewired itself
Mm,
in some way, miraculous way, and the person, But again, I think I think now with everything I've learned, that may or may not be true. But we have a lot of instances in neuroscience that we can't explain, like people who savants,
mm,
people who have knowledge that there's no way, skill sets and knowledge that they could not have possibly
mm.
acquired, like, in by like if they're 5 years old, or things they haven't experienced that they just know. And also we have cases where, like, it's funny, we have all these theories about all the regions of the brain, and like, visual cortex does this, and like temporoparietal does this,
Mm.
and then you've got a case of a person who has like extreme, let's say, hydrocephalus, which is like where there's a lot of it, basically there's like a tiny piece of actual brain matter, and their
The rest is
brain is filled
fluid.
with
Yeah.
fluid. Yeah. And then but they function fairly normally or well enough, like to the point where we can't explain, like, oh, but they don't have a fully developed visual cortex, or they don't have a fully developed amygdala. How can they function? Like, we just, those are just mysteries
Mm.
in neuroscience for now. And yet usually we just explain it with neuroplasticity, which basically means we don't know.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Another interesting one that is a kind of often cited as a counter argument to the radio metaphor is general anesthesia. Because people
Uh,
tend to think, well, if the consciousness is separate from the brain and is ultimately able to perceive itself by its very nature, why does shutting off the brain with anesthesia render you unconscious?
yeah, because it's like turning the TV off.
Mm. Mm. So again, it's like, as you say, turning off the perceived translation of consciousness, but not the signal of consciousness itself.
Right. Yeah. There's yeah, I mean, to me it's just that.
Fair enough. Yeah, yeah. Very simple answered.
I'm interested in, I think we're going to see in the next few years some really interesting research come out. I think that so, in the literature, altered states of consciousness, so things like hypnosis or meditation or psychedelics or breath work, people tend to have these, what we call emergent experiences or anomalous experiences, or whatever you want to call them, more frequently in those states. And I think that with the surge in psychedelic research, it's already been happening with meditation research, but meditation research has been so secularized and
Mm.
so
Demystified.
yeah, I mean, just so they could do it, because it's like, to get it approved, it had to be that way. So I think, but with psychedelics, it's going to be different. And I think that you're starting to see with, for example, the studies that are being done at University College London,
Mm-hmm.
with DMT, where they're putting people into these extended DMT states to kind of map the space, like this alternate reality that they're going to kind of answer the question of, is it just a hallucination that they're having in their mind, or are they going to some space where they're getting, let's say, information that they bring back, that's verifiable, that they would have no other way of knowing.
Mm.
So they're starting to do that and kind of explore, like when people do DMT, a lot of them report fairies, angels, elves, beings. And so, and a lot of them sometimes have messages for them or can tell them things that are going to happen in the future or things like that. So they're starting to look into that. And I think that what will be, I mean, if I had a wish, like if we could just have funding go into this, I would start exploring the space between, like that, like psychedelic experiences or just altered states. But I'm just saying psychedelics because that's what I know is going to start being funded a lot now. Um, but then also people who are intuitive on their own or have these
Mm-hmm.
experiences on their own, and starting to map, like, what is going on energy wise, frequency wise, biochemically. Because there is, for example, there's an effort, uh, being led by John, I think, Chavez. He's like has an organization called DMT Quest, and it's kind of like this to use DMT as this like um, pathway to explore all these topics of like we know that we're in a material paradigm, people are going to want to focus on something material, so it's like let's take a molecule like DMT and use it as a gateway to explore all these things,
Mm-hmm.
but to start to map that space of let's just assume that I mean, people are having these experiences. So let's start to map it and see what is the difference physiologically, biochemically, and then, start to see if it's verifiable.
And then
So
start to build
we'll
a
see.
theory off of that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the other thing I wanted to mention was you talked about the temporal parietal area of the brain. That kind of made me think what your thoughts are on the Olaf Blanke study, if you are familiar with that showed.
The out of body.
That's right. Yeah, it was either stimulation or the making dormant the temporal parietal junction. I don't know much
Yeah.
about that, so I was curious from your perspective what you thought about that.
Yeah, that was well, I countered that when I first started looking into this. Yeah, there oftentimes neuroscientists who are not familiar with the literature will cite stuff like that and will say, oh, if you like stimulate the temporoparietal junction, you do get these very weird experiences of like people saying they're see dead people or see God, or you have a mystical experience or an out of body experience. And people will explain like everybody else's
Mm.
experiences with that and being like, oh, maybe you had some like rogue, uh, electric
Yeah, some sort of
activity
epileptic kind of
right
effects.
in
Yeah.
your
Mm.
temporoparietal lobe. But actually, there's this effort out of the Esalen Institute. Are you familiar
I'm not.
with it? Oh, okay, so the Esalen Institute was this institute in Big Sur, California. It was founded in the like 60s and 70s. It was part of the whole countercultural revolution. A lot of like transpersonal psychology came out of there. A lot of the early psychedelic research, a lot of therapies like maybe no, not internal family systems, but like gestalt therapy came out of there. So it was like a hub for mind, body, spirit experiences and research. So it's still around today. It's like this really iconic, legendary institute, and they have a center for theory and research where scholars get together, and they have this 20-year effort called oh shit, am I gonna remember what's it called? But survival. It's like Sursem. That's what it's called. The seminars on survival, and it's been going for 20 years. It was supposed to be just like a seminar series about evidence for survival of consciousness past bodily death. But they ended up publishing in the last few years 3 huge volumes of books combining all the evidence. Um, and in one of them, the first one, it's called Irreducible Mind.
Oh, I
And
have
these are
that.
all,
Yeah, by
yeah, yeah.
Kelly,
So
Edward Kelly.
yes,
Hmm.
Ed Kelly and uh, yeah, Ed Kripal, like there's all these researchers who've contributed to
Mm.
it. But in Irreducible Mind, they actually go into excruciating detail
It's a very big
of
book.
the
Yeah,
it's
it's a very
but
chunky
they
book.
go into those, yeah, they go really into those studies and like into every detail and show that the experience you get from stimulating the temporoparietal junction with like electric or electromagnetic, let's say, energy is very different than the
Mm.
experiences you get from people who report them naturally. So they're like people like to just step back and like 1,000-foot view dismiss them or equate them, but they're like when you go into the details of the studies, they're very different.
Mm.
And it doesn't adequately explain people's experiences.
Mm. And I suppose one final area that's rather important in this is I myself am not religious in any sense. And people seem to often conflate life after death, the concept of life after death and spirit, etc., with religious views. Um, Whereas I would argue that questions of that kind of nature are fundamentally a scientific one, which is why I don't like the term paranormal, because to me, everything that's currently considered paranormal is just an aspect of science and nature that we haven't understood yet. It exists, it's just not well documented or understood. What are your thoughts generally on, I suppose, the religious takes on Christianity is the main one over here, so things like heaven and hell or nirvana or other things like that, versus your approach at it from a scientific point of view? I suppose the usefulness of both approaches.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree that I mean, like what we've been discussing here, the consciousness, whether it survives bodily death, whether it's an energy, information, or whatever. I think that is a science question that a science and philosophy question that we can start to address. So I think you don't need religion for that at all. I think religion serves its purpose, though. I think that, I mean, I think many of us have negative connotations. I don't know, I do, about, around religion, but I think that it does spirituality, at least for me. Actually, you know that phrase, spiritual but not religious, it originated from Esalen.
Oh,
So
that's interesting.
yeah, so because they were, yeah, promoting spirituality as a healthy, way, like as an integral part of
Mm.
being human. It's very much a part of who we are,
Mm.
and has been for since the beginning of the existence of humanity. But religion, right, is a totally separate thing than spirituality. It's
Yes,
more about
and
rules and dogma.
interestingly, I think, which is uncommon opinion, is that spirituality, for me, I believe spirituality is more closely related to science and philosophy than it is to religion.
No, I agree. And I think religion is useful for a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people. Otherwise, it would have died
Mm.
out, but it seems to serve a purpose.
Mm. I mean,
So,
it's fantastic for
yeah.
the sense of community, and the
Oh, yeah.
if you can, live off of the comfort that your life is looked after and that you will go to a better place after death. That's fantastic. If it doesn't work for me. I need to understand things and have evidence for
Yeah.
them. But
Yeah.
certainly,
Me too.
if it gives life the meaning, then it's certainly very valuable. But for me personally, it
Oh,
doesn't
yeah.
work. You know.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people feel that way now because of just like the last couple hundred
Mm,
years, our focus on the scientific
mm,
revolution
mm,
and the Enlightenment. I think a lot of people feel that way. So,
mm.
um, and I think that it's like we threw the baby out with the bathwater. Like we were like, no religion, but then we lost spirituality and
Yeah,
meaning. And so
that's right.
it's like
Yeah.
trying to find that balance
Yeah,
now.
and I
So
think spirituality, hand in hand with science and philosophy, offer an even greater future for our satisfaction, because I think religion offers the comfort of a heaven, but it also includes the fear of a hell. Whereas I think spirituality offers something we would be akin to as heaven, but doesn't include that negative aspect of it, and that it's ultimately you will go to where you need to be, but the difference
right.
is, and here's the evidence for it.
Right, exactly. Yeah, no, I feel the same way.
Mm.
And I needed that when I was, one of my main struggles when I was at the beginning of this journey was like I said, some people were just okay accepting a mystery, or they were okay accepting a belief, and I just couldn't. And it
Mm.
was driving me crazy. It was like mental anguish because I was like, why can't I just believe?
Mm.
It would just be easier. But I just couldn't. Like I
Mm.
needed to have evidence
Yeah,
and a lot of
which
it.
is exactly
So,
why you eventually became a scientist, because that's the whole
right.
part of being human
Probably.
is wanting to know how things work and why things are the way they are. And as very
Right.
much like
Yeah.
you, I can't just believe something unless I have reason to
Mm.
believe it, which is nice, but is also difficult sometimes, as you say.
Yeah. It's personally
Mm,
difficult sometimes.
it is, absolutely. Okay, well, would you like to let people know where they can get in contact, find you, what kind of published works you offer, etc.?
Yeah. So I have a book called Proof of Spiritual Phenomena, a neuroscientist's discovery of the ineffable mysteries of the universe, the longest title ever. And you can find links to that on my website, which is just monasobhaniphd.com. I write a Substack. I used to write for the Brave New World of Psychedelic Science, but in January I'm transitioning to my new one, which is called Cosmos Coffee. No, Cosmos Science and Coffee. It's like so new, I don't even know the name. But there's links to that on the website.